Welcome back. The University of Johannesburg Arts and Culture will host the Johannesburg chapter of the Poetry Africa International Festival from the 3rd to the 5th of October. Now, poets, artists and cultural enthusiasts will gather in celebration of creativity and expression. One of the highlights for this year's edition is a show called Revolution of Words. Written and curated by award-winning poet Lebo Mashile, the show features poems from the grade 11 and 12 curriculum, alongside modern poets that reflect on the challenges of today's way of life. Lebo Mashile joins us now and will talk to us all things poetry. Lebo, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for making me wake up very early this morning and come talk to you.
It was worth it,
It's worth it. I'm glad to be talking about this. Thank you for talking about it.
Let's begin with your own journey. Yes. I mean, as an award-winning poet, in South Africa, when we think poetry, we think Lebo Mashile. Talk to us about how the spoken word has influenced different facets of your own personal life.
Well, I mean, I've dedicated my life to this. I think when I made the decision that I wanted to be a poet, I was a law student at Wits, and I discovered poetry just because of the cultural movement that was happening in Johannesburg at the time, all the live art that was thriving in the late 90s and early 2000s. So I located myself within that. I thought, this is incredible. I have to be a part of this. And then everybody around me told me that I would never make a living doing this. So I had to realize, like, not making a living wasn't an option.
Right.
And I said, I have two skills that come out of this thing. There's an ability to connect with people, and there's an ability with language. If I can use those two skills and multiply them, I can find different ways of earning a living. A living will come. And that's what I've done. So I'm a poet, yes, but I'm a published author, I'm a recording artist, I'm a voiceover artist, I'm a presenter, I'm a producer, I'm a playwright, I'm an actress, you know, and I'm moving between these worlds, but I think my entry point into all of them is still poetry.
And I think it's very interesting that you mentioned this for any parent whose child is interested to get into poetry that might be asking themselves, but how are you going to make a living out of this? And here you are with all these slashings of
slashings. You have to be a slashist.
You must be a slashist
if you're a creative, and I think that's the way the economy is going globally anyway, with where technology is headed, where creative industries are headed. All of us are going to have to learn how to integrate new skills very quickly into our arsenal in order to be able to express ourselves and survive.
So let's talk about the Poetry Africa International Festival. 27 years in the making, almost as old as our democracy. What are the objectives of this fest?
Poetry Africa is, I think, one of the leading festivals on the continent. It's curated with a view to highlighting contemporary Pan-African poets. But across the diaspora, across the world. It's a fantastic festival. I've performed there many, many, many times. But it also has an agenda to expand what the conversation around poetry is. So looking at how poetry impacts political issues, how poetry lives in different disciplines and art forms, reflecting on the contributions of poets who have had formidable careers, reflecting on the multiplicity and hybridity of languages that we're dealing with in South Africa. But poetry itself has multiple forms, and Poetry Africa is deliberate and intentional about looking at how poetry is evolving and making sure that poets who've contributed to our landscape, as well as poets who are shaping their voices, contributing now, are all a part of the same conversation.
And that's a beautiful conversation to be having, how it opens up dialogue across industries for young people and old people to be able to share in ideas and ideologies. Now, there's a very special feature this year, which is going to be at the Joburg Leg, and that's the Revolution of Words, which you curated and wrote. You spent the first half of the year working on this body of work?
I spent the first half of the year curating this with Jade Bauer, who's an incredible theater maker, director, producer, academic. She's based at UJ, as well as Kwaz Root, also fantastic, fantastic poet. We kind of come from the same era, the same scene of the poetry scene. But he's now teaching at UJ and developing young artists. So we spent the first part of the year poring over literally hundreds of poems, the what you'd call the canon, the set works that young people are learning right now in grade 11 and grade 12. And our task was to figure out how to create a story with this work that speaks to where contemporary poetry is at and the conversations that are happening in contemporary poetry right now. And I mean, when just looking at South African poetry, you are talking about a history of colonialism. You're also talking about our own oral tradition, our own indigenous traditional canon. You're talking about resistance poetry, struggle poetry. And now, in the last 30 years, you're also talking about how poetry has lended itself to different art forms. You're talking about hip hop.
Yes.
You're talking about contemporary Black feminist poets who've shifted the landscape of poetry. So all of this forms part of the arc that we are speaking about. And it's been such a great pleasure to be immersed in the work of poets who I respect and who I admire. It's like history talking to the present constantly, you know.
Yeah.
We've made characters out of contemporary South African poets, and to see how these young people have taken this on, they are fantastic. They've also written their own material for this, so their clan names, their Tagazelos, their stuff is in it. And I mean, these are young people who are studying like Babang are studying accounting, human resources, actuarial science, but their commitment to the arts is something that it's so gratifying to watch. It's so gratifying to hear other people speaking my words, and also to see the impact that the arts is having on their lives, whatever they become, whether they become engineers or architects. The impact of what this experience is going to be on their lives is something that's going to be with them forever. And that's what I appreciate UJ Arts and Culture, because they don't necessarily teach art as a, UJ doesn't have an art faculty as such. I mean, they've got architecture and design, but they don't have, you know, drama, for example.
Yeah.
But they make sure that young people across disciplines are exposed to the opportunity to be able to interact with contemporary artists, leading contemporary artists, and to be fed and empowered by the arts.
And how important is that? I mean, having been someone that studied law and ended up in the arts, just the well-roundedness of a human being who is going to go into accounting or medicine, but understanding what art does to the soul.
I was at Joy of Jazz last night listening to Tutupuane, who's just released an incredible album based on my poetry, using my poetry as lyrics. And to see, you know, the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, and Zanele Mbeki there, to see, you know, leading luminaries, people in our country who have shaped our country across different sectors, but who have a deep appreciation for jazz. You need art to be a fully fledged human being. You need art to think critically. You need art to have an emotional vocabulary. You need art to expand your inner landscape, the landscape of your heart and the landscape of your mind. No matter what you do, whether you are an engineer, business person, whether you are an IT, you need the realm of creativity to understand yourself and to be able to interpret society, and also to create a vision for yourself. I feel like that's who we are as creatives. We're in the business of vision. You know? So I think it's important, it's absolutely essential to make sure that young people have access. The arts are not a nice to have. They are an absolute necessity, especially in a society that's dealing with the complexity and the trauma that we are dealing with.
Right.
Yeah.
And speaking of that trauma and complexity, and you spoke about the indigenous canon that we still need to tap into. How important is it for us to be also looking at our own languages? I mean, when we did poetry in high school, you know, but how important is it now for us to be able to express ourselves, like you say, in a way that we should?
I think there's an awakening that is happening in South Africa, but I think it's an awakening that is happening across the kind of Pan-African world, you know. We are connecting to ourselves, our indigeneity in different ways, you know, at different levels. And I think it's incredibly liberating. So it makes sense. The fact that I'm able to exist as a poet in South Africa that has the abysmal literacy rates that we have, but when I stand on stage, a 90-year-old grandmother, Wako Makhaeng, has a culture cultural reference point for what it is I do in English. That's how deep the roots of this art form go, you know? It's embedded in our psyches, it's who we are, it's affirming, it extends our lineages, it gives us a context for what has happened to us, it gives us a context for where we are going. So we deal with language looking at a poet, for example, like Ike Muila from Soweto, who writes in Iscamto and writes in different languages, so Zital in the same poem. And then we stretch it all the way to, you know, someone like Hip Hop Banzula, who was a formidable figure in terms of bringing the Motswako movement into the mainstream, into hip-hop, writing in his indigenous language, Setswana. He saw himself as a rapper, but he was very closely connected to the spoken word movement, you know? So when we look at like something like Isithakazelo Zethu, they also feed these two very different kinds of writers, but if we didn't have this indigenous connection to poetry, these two guys wouldn't exist.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you're one that's been on global stages. How much of a footprint does South African poetry have internationally?
South African poetry is formidable. I mean, I've been to, I've performed in like almost 40 countries. What we are able to do with poetry in this corner of the world. And I've seen incredible, prolific, fantastic poets. But I've not seen poets who have access to the level of visibility that we have in this country as poets. And I think because of that visibility, because of the cultural context that we're coming from, it means that poets get interesting opportunities to be able to flex their muscles and spread their wings, you know? You've got poets like Spokazi Jonas, whose work around gender has now become a part of the curriculum in the form of film. You've got a poet like Kabiso Vili, the current slam champion, who is doing poetry with like AI at UJ. So the kind of opportunities that exist in South Africa are truly extraordinary. Poets love coming to South Africa and performing here.
Wow.
Poets love coming to perform at Poetry Africa. They love the way we engage with poets, with poetry. You know, South African audiences also, we don't just watch. We're on stage with you.
We are there.
We are a part of the thing. So people come here and they appreciate that. They've never experienced that. Yeah.
So lastly, where can people find Revolution of Words? I know it's crisscrossing across the country over the next couple of days. And objectively, what do you want audiences to take from that experience?
Sure. So one of the recurring things that people say to me is, I hated poetry at school, but I love you. You know? And to me, that shows that there's a disconnect between the way that we are taught and what is actually happening in contemporary South African poetry. It is relevant. It is reflective of who we are. It is representative. The issues that we're dealing with are alive inside of our poetry and always have been. So I want to dispel this myth. We want to dispel this myth that the literary canon is something outside of you. You are the literary canon. You who's breaking and shifting language on social media and saying what must to can happen. That's also poetry.
And making the pots happen.
And making the pots happen. Poets are renegades. Poets use language in like the way a sculptor uses clay. We shift it, and in that we end up shifting language for a broader society. So I say all of that to say the first performance is on the 5th of October at the Curating Theatre at UJ, and then it goes to the main festival, Poetry Africa in Durban, for 2 performances, which is going to be a fantastic experience for these young people. They get to have the immersive experience of being part of the entire festival and all the panels and watching the performances. So that's really enriching, and I'm grateful that Durban gets to see it as well. Then it comes back to Johannesburg for on the 17th of October, again at the Curating Theatre.
All right. Lebo Mashile, thank you so much for joining us. An absolute pleasure. I'm sure audiences will be very excited to watch this body of work.
Thank you
so much for joining us.
I appreciate you.
And that was award-winning poet Lebo Mashile speaking to us there about the Revolution of Word, which is taking place next month. Now, let's